not had enterprising skills. So some of the barriers that I think we can see. So what about in Mexico? If you could move on, please, and put the whole slide on. According to SAGAPA, rural regions in Mexico, 80% of the land, home to up to 37 million people, and somebody will tell me my figures are out of date. Organic cultivation, 2.3% of the 21 million hectares of cultivated land in Mexico, which is an astonishing figure. But what we do have is unsustainable farming practice in many areas, which is leading to land degradation. Poor drainage, low relief, in certain areas low rainfall, variable climate. And these are just the factors which are outside of your control. These are exogenous factors. So what are the objectives of SAGAPA? And we'll talk about one of my colleagues later on, we'll talk about them in more detail. But they're very clear, raising the level of human development and heritage of Mexicans who live in rural areas and coastal regions, improve the income of producers by enabling you to think about expanding your markets, going outside of traditional markets, thinking about value-adding processes for all of your products and services, reversing the deterioration of ecosystems, and finally driving the harmonious development of rural areas through concerted actions. So what are the challenges for Mexico's rural regions? If you move on to the next slide, please. These are threefold: a huge population, the majority of whom live in poverty conditions, vast human resources, particularly young, greater contribution to national development is fundamental. But what's interesting in terms of one of the positive things is that Mexico has been a huge important laboratory for rural policy innovation in the past. And that, I think, should continue to be the case as you move forward. And there is the beginnings of an aggregation or a disaggregation of your rural budget and support through SAGAPA's policies. Okay, let me move on from the sort of the wider policy context to focus down and drill down to rural businesses themselves. I'll give you an example. If you could move on to the next slide, please. The key issues for rural businesses are these things. On the left, business management skills, IT, marketing and selling, cooperation and networking. But the key issues are those in the middle, entrepreneurial qualities and values. And what are they? Can you move on? In the work that I've done recently, there are three key skills that are becoming fundamental for farmers. And those are the opportunity recognition, strategic planning, and networking. Out of all the work I've done in Europe, with interviewing 120 farmers in 6 countries, a recent questionnaire to 3,500 farmers, and I'll talk about it later on, I asked them what are the key things that are necessary for a farmer to survive in an increasingly competitive market. And that's what they told me: opportunity recognition, strategic planning, and networking capability. So that's maybe something to think about or consider. A key question for many people is this one: do you diversify or do you specialize? So let's move on. And here's an example. And those of you who want to look at some of these later on can check up these websites. I'm giving you the first of 3 examples. Oilseed rape. Not something that's particularly grown extensively in Mexico, but is now grown throughout England, and you'll see it as being a major crop for many people. If you could move on, please. The price of oilseed rape, if you put on this next slide on it, in 2006 was £136 per tonne. I put English and Mexican prices on. And if you take it right through to 2010, you'll see that the price of oilseed rape has moved considerably, and last year went back to 2007 prices to a price of 264, or 5,000 Mexican pesos. So one colleague, and if you could move on please, decided that he would diversify. He grew rape, but he wasn't getting the price that he wanted for rape. So this farmer is a major producer. He has 3,000 hectares. He leveraged in some huge amounts of capital through a partnership in the value chain with some distributors and producers, and bought himself a processing plant. And what he did was he produced, if you could go back, this oilseed rape. Oilseed rape, those of you who like potatoes will know that the best oil I've always used is virgin olive oil. But I tell you that oilseed rape beats it, no problem. Fantastic. But it's very expensive. So, let me move on. This particular farmer did talk about assessing an opportunity. Move on, please. And what he did, he looked at the market potential, he looked at his existing market share, he talked about the ways that he was going to get to the marketplace, he talked about the business viability of the product. He then asked himself, is it worth me doing it? And how am I going to do it? And what he did was he got some partnerships in, and so that his initial investment would be redistributed across 5 different people. Now, this farmer is not particularly entrepreneurial. His technological skills are very good, but he recognized, he had enough ability to recognize that he had to buy in some of the skills to enable him to go to market for oilseed rape. And the biggest energizer of that change was his wife, not him. Because his wife knew what was wanted in the marketplace, but he didn't. He didn't understand his market. And the last point that I'll make on there, sorry, you could just flick back if you didn't mind, is this notion of the last one. I don't know how you would translate this into Mexican, but like any marriage, the last thing we do is when we go into a marriage or a business relationship, we actually think about how is it going to fail. This guy had enough ability to recognize, to think about what if it fails 3-5 years into the process, as if the price of oilseed rape drops considerably to make it no longer viable. Okay, can you move on? So, I told you that I interviewed a number of farmers just recently and had 3,000 questionnaires. Out of 650 farmers that responded, 90% of them had diversified. And these were the areas that they'd diversified into. I won't go through them all. I hope that you will be able to get a copy of the slides afterwards. But what those people identified was something like 450 different kinds of entrepreneurial ventures that they could go into. Everything from different kinds of trading, right through to creating telephone masts to develop information technology infrastructure. So, and I've now got a list of 600 diversified activities for 600 farmers, which is quite phenomenal. And I suspect that if you looked in this room at the opportunities and the diversified activities that you have all engaged in, I think you would see that there would be quite some phenomenal activities in the richness of the people just in this room here today, I suspect. But the question I would ask you is, how do you share that knowledge between each other? Because this is the important thing for me, is that it's a knowledge transfer, as I said in my first slide. Okay, can we move on, please? Go back to this rapeseed producer. As much strategic planning as you want in the farm sector, as you well know, but can go wrong. Can you give me the next slide, please? In a field near me in 2007, this farm, this field, which is perhaps 10 hectares, for the first time in 50 years was completely underwater, the very opposite of what you have. If you go on to the next slide, in July, 1 month later, sorry, go back. You never ever get stuck combine harvesters, but this combine harvester was stuck 1 month later, and it couldn't do it. And if you see, there's a tractor trying to pull the combine out unsuccessfully. Strategic planning can go wrong. And the next slide, please. And this is in August, just 2 months after July, when the cultivator was finding it difficult to engage in activity. I mean, so just in a 3-month PROEUR period. Can we move on, please? So, what's the context? What I'm suggesting is that for all of you who are in business or want to develop business, requires quite considerable skill. We know this as practitioners, as business people. But there are significant barriers to entrepreneurial activity, and we've already indicated some of those are outside of the farmer's control: infrastructure, geographical climate, land topography, etc., etc. But there are others that are actually in the control of farmers, and those are financial management, human resource management, quality management, marketing. How many of you as farmers know exactly to the peso the value of your product or service? Exactly. And I suspect not many. But a farmer does all of these kind of activities, which leads to managerial overload. So in terms of small farmers, there are significant barriers to entrepreneurial activity. And I think this is part of this project, is to think about how we can encourage and develop and facilitate the development of entrepreneurial skill. Can we move on? So what are the pressures on farmers, on you as farmers? Well, these are there. It's very difficult for particularly smaller farmers, but also larger farmers, to achieve economies of scale and economies of production. You're not able to spread your costs particularly well because of the variability of the cyclical nature of farming. Smaller farmers are not well equipped in terms of capital and plant. But perhaps most importantly, and this is just not a phenomenon in Latin America, it's a phenomenon in Europe as well, is that farmers, and the farmers that I work with, are just not able to meet the increasingly demanding market specification demands of big supermarkets. Now, in America, I would imagine it would be Walmart. In the UK, it's Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, who control very, very tightly the ability to farmers to become diversifying and enterprising capability people. So in a sense, all of you are very vulnerable to economic pressures. So diversification opportunities. A very quick slide, and these are those. And I'll discuss this in a little bit more detail. The opportunities that you have are, first of all, diversification outside of your traditional sector. So moving into rural tourism, for example, or something completely different to the farm. Rural tourism and countryside skills. Into the bottom quadrant, a whole range of things from moving from into arable farming, into conservation, and then into other areas such as landscaping, livestock, whatever. So these are opportunities that you all have, but some more than others. And the development strategies, if you can move on, I think are 9. And I'm just going to pick a couple of those. A project that I've just finished working on in the south of England, which is Grade 1 land in Cornwall. Very much arable land and few very, very good cattle. The only way that farmers in that region of England are able to be sustained is because of immigrant labour. But that immigrant labour is starting to move. We originally had Polish people, but the Polish people are now starting to become more enterprising and want to go into other activities. So they're going into urban environments. They are being replaced by people from Latvia, Lithuania, Russia, and are moving in, and they are sustaining the economy in the south of England and in other parts of England. But there are some farmers that I've worked with that are just not able to be enterprising any longer. And the question I would ask is, what do we do with them? So the first one, sorry, if you could go back, I'm not finished on that box, is on the left-hand side is the whole notion of abandonment of farming. That could be the last strategy that people could engage in. But there are other activities that people engage in. For example, cooperation with other farmers, which is now becoming a significant way forward to compete competitively, is cooperation with other farmers. But as you'll see in an example in a moment, many other farmers are going into external business. Okay, let's move on, please. This is one example. This is a farmer, and if you could put all his details on, who is, has a very small holding of 35 acres in County Fermanagh. He's diversified from into honey production and potatoes and vegetables. But what he also does is he actually engages in other activities. He teaches Irish in a local school, which is a declining language. He also has got some money from the regional creative arts community to make instruments. Now, the benefit of this person is that his neighbours in the small village are starting to really love him because he's creating more economic change in the local community by him taking on this business. He employs 2 apprentices. In the summer months he runs courses. The local hotels are starting to like him because he's putting people into bed and breakfast. He's also keeping jobs within the local community. So this is one man who had no idea of the value added that he would do once he started his diversified businesses. This one man. The value chain and the amount of people that he's keeping in work is absolutely phenomenal. So if you do an inventory of the people in your business who you actually support up and down the value chain, you might be quite surprised to think about how many people you do actually support in terms of work, employment, training, etc., etc. Here's another example. This is my neighbour. This is the farm next to my property. Neil Harland, he has 65 acres of very, very poor land. He's got a degree in electronical engineering, he's 46, and he's a sheep farmer. He's got 250 sheep, of prime moorland sheep. His income is probably about £6,000 per year through his farm business, which is not sustainable for him, his wife and his children. So he had to diversify. He reduced his flock and had some subsidy to reduce his flock. He's gone into catering, outside of catering, with his wife. He started to develop rural crafts and bring people in to do, now you don't have dry stone walls in Mexico, but I'll show you a picture of some in a moment. Rural crafts, hedge laying, tree felling, dry stone walling, selling lamb at the point, and it's nearly organic. But he also has a computer business. He teaches, but he's also a social entrepreneur. He launched a website called eskvalley.com. It's the last thing on the slide. And he's over a region of 20 miles. He has networked all of the farmers, of which there are 80, and all of the rural businesses, so they can trade through a website. So when you want a particular skill, you can go onto the website, and it's a social enterprise for which he achieves no money, but what he achieves, he value adds. He adds value to the community. And this is just 3 farmers that are known to me. And if you could put the next slide on, there is sheep, there's a wall, there's his farm at the bottom. That's my house with the roses up the front of it. And this is another rural craft at the bottom where he brings people in from towns who want to go and experience the rural, and he brings them in and they build bridges and walls and cut trees down, for which they pay him money to do his work, which is a lovely way of getting people to do things. And the final slide, the next one, is about, this is his farm, and this is a wall that we've just finished building to keep sheep out of. And these 2 guys on the left, that's me with the blue shirt on, the 2 guys on the left paid money to come and work on the farm. So you can't beat it. You get a job done, but you also get some income as well. So let's just move on back to a link to a rural strategy. My work would suggest that in terms of developing enterprising communities, it's vital to develop local development strategies, firstly. And that has to have a link to what regions mean by enterprise policy, linked to sustainability. What does it mean? Clear vision, clear priorities, so that everybody understands the framework and the parameters. Services for entrepreneurs. It's not enough to simply say to people, be entrepreneurial. People can be taught to be enterprising. People can develop enterprising skills. It's a myth that people cannot be taught to be enterprising, an absolute myth. Whether or not you do it is a different matter. Linked to that is developing what I would call a rural business charter, a small rural business charter. It's segmenting your enterprises and increasing community-to-community learning, so that the guy who developed the website, his experience can be replicated across other communities, because communities are actually very keen to share their skills and experience with other communities. Some concluding comments. Next slide, please. So, in order to understand the barriers to enterprise, I think we need to understand how they manifest themselves to individual people. So it's taking the individual and the community and trying to understand their local specificities of need. As you well know, those who have been involved in this project, gathering rural evidence is painstakingly slow, but it's very rewarding. To watch a farmer say, of course, is a wonderful, enriching experience. But from now on, across the globe, rural policy cannot be about special pleading, that my case is more important than yours. It's about a new agenda of community values and policies. And writing rural policy requires good evidence and a good narrative and good argument. So, the last question that I would leave you with, if you could go on to the last slide, please. Who would you support then? Is it those who are sustainable, who are not sustainable, but could be sustainable, may be sustainable, who are not sustainable? At some point, the notion of support must be pulled away for some farmers to enable them to exit with dignity. Or do you spread your bets? Thank you.
¿Cuáles son los apoyos que cuentan ahí en Inglaterra estas unidades? Y también, que si el crédito es fácil de obtener para ellos.
Two good questions, Mr. Yusuf. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Is this on? Two very good questions. I assume that you mean support from central government. What we have is the equivalent that you have in the UK is called DEFRA, Department for Rural Affairs, of which from the EU they are given, farmers are given subsidy through the Common Agricultural Policy. The Common Agricultural Policy, as many of you may well know, in 2013 is becoming changed dramatically, so that the amount of support for individual farmers is being removed, which is my point about we need to recognise that farmers need to be encouraged to become enterprising by only gently removing the pillar that they've had their heads on for many years. Because you cannot just pull that away, because many farmers would then fail. So it's about a gradual process. So in the UK we've introduced three kinds of support. We've local level schemes, high level schemes of support, and organic support schemes for different farmers who are paid subsidies. But they need to actually deliver on those subsidies in terms of production quotas. So whatever industry they are in, whether or not it's milk, arable, or beef, for example, they must develop on those quotas. So those are the national support. But regional level, very quickly, we have the equivalent of the Mexican Farmers Union, who provide support. And increasingly, my view is that support needs to be drilled down where farmer support agencies employed by and understood by farmers themselves, who understand the local market problems, are engaged in providing that support. The second part of your question was about credit. Depends on who you want to go to and depends on the business case. Credit is relatively easy to get, but you must have a decent business case, which goes back to my whole notion of strategic planning. Not a problem, I wouldn't have thought.
Gracias, doctor Elwi. Si hay alguna otra pregunta, por favor. Sí, aquí otra. ¿Puedes decir su nombre, por favor?
Marcos Oviedo, de Cedesol. La pregunta es, ¿de qué tamaño promedio son los predios de estos emprendedores en Inglaterra, de estos con los que trabaja?
Okay. The first farmer that I talked about has a large farm of 3,000 acres. The average farm holding in the UK is probably about 300 acres. So what's that, 200 hectares? So that's what I meant about earlier on. There is no such thing as an homogeneous size of land. Depending on the region, Mr. Oviedo, you will have some regions which can provide huge farm land of 5,000 acres, but small upland farmers might only have 30 acres. And I think the key issue also to recognise is that for some policymakers, which goes back to your question, farmers purely have an economic function. And it is my view that farmers have much more than an economic function, but they have a social role as well. And policymakers who assume that farmers are only involved in economic planning, I think, are mistaken.
Gracias. Había una pregunta acá y luego regresamos aquí al frente. Por favor.
Sí.
Su nombre, por favor.
Mi nombre es profesor Mariano Ureño Gurrola, del estado de Zacatecas. Primeramente, sí decíamos que esto que se nos otorgó se nos reproduzca y se nos entregue al final del simposio. Mi pregunta es la siguiente: ¿cuál es el sistema de riego que ha funcionado más en el Reino Unido y qué tipo de fertilizante utilizan?
Irrigation. It's just, we don't have a problem with irrigation. In fact, it's well, in certain regions, people in the southern parts of the UK, in larger cities where people are starting to build more houses, then it's starting to become a problem. But in most regions of the UK, in fact, it's the very opposite. We have plenty of water. In relation to your question about what fertilizers are used, I think the simple answer is it depends on the particular product that you're using. I think it really does depend on the issue. I mean, people in the north of England are trying to use more organic